never imagined it caught me nephew in the bath. I never imagined it would lead to a moment that would change everything. What happens when innocent gestures blur into something more? Stick around to see how this intense, forbidden story unfolds. Don't forget to subscribe and share where you're watching from. When I walked into the bathroom and saw my nephew sitting in the tub, his head hung low, his shoulders trembling slightly, I felt an electric jolt of tension ripple through me. His bare back was turned to me, the faint sound of water dripping the only noise in the room. He hadn't heard me enter. He was too lost in his thoughts, or perhaps trying to hide from them. In that split second, I knew I should leave, but my feet remained frozen to the tile floor, my breath shallow and unsteady. "Are you okay?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. He turned his head sharply, startled, his damp hair clinging to his face. His eyes met mine for a fleeting moment, wide with a mix of embarrassment and something else I couldn't quite place. Vulnerability, maybe. "Aunt Jenna," he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't hear you come in." I wanted to step back, to give him the privacy he clearly needed, but there was something in his tone that kept me rooted. I noticed the redness in his eyes, the way his hands gripped the edge of the tub as if he were holding on for dear life. "I didn't mean to. I stammered, feeling awkward and out of place. He shook his head, a weak laugh escaping his lips. "It's fine. It's not like I haven't seen you barge in before." He was trying to make light of it, but the heaviness in the room remained. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to break the silence. "What's going on, Liam? You don't seem like yourself." The words felt both motherly and invasive, and I hated how they sounded. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the water. "It's stupid. Just some things on my mind." "Nothing's stupid if it's bothering you," I said gently, stepping closer to the door but still unwilling to fully leave. "You can talk to me if you want." My voice wavered, betraying my own nerves. For a moment he didn't respond. The steam from the bath created a hazy veil, and I thought maybe he wasn't going to say anything at all. But then he sighed, his broad shoulders slumping. "I don't think you'd understand," he muttered. "No one really does." The way he said it made my chest tighten. Here he was, this young man, so sure that no one in the world could comprehend what he was going through. I wanted to comfort him, to make him feel seen and heard, but I knew I was treading dangerous waters. "You'd be surprised," I replied softly, the words hanging in the air between us. In that moment, as he turned back toward the wall, exposing more of his vulnerability, I realized that this wasn't just about helping him. This was the beginning of something I couldn't yet understand, something I wasn't sure I could control. Mm. 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 The tension lingered long after I left the bathroom, closing the door softly behind me. I pressed my back against the cool hallway wall, trying to steady my breathing. What had just happened in there? Was it just a concerned aunt checking on her nephew? Or was there something else? Something I didn't want to admit even to myself. Liam had moved in with us 2 months ago, shortly after my husband Eric suggested we offer him a place to stay while he sorted out his life. Liam was my brother's son, and his family had been going through a rough patch. Divorce, financial strain, the usual mess. He had nowhere else to go, and Eric, ever the generous one, thought it would be good to help him out. I agreed, of course, though I didn't think much about how it would change the dynamic in our home. At first, it was easy having him here. Liam was polite, clean, and mostly kept to himself. He was 21, in the middle of figuring out what he wanted to do with his life after dropping out of college. His room was in the basement, giving him his own space, and our interactions were minimal at best. Just casual chats in the kitchen or a passing good morning. But lately, things had shifted. It was hard to pinpoint exactly when or how, but I had started noticing him more, the way he moved, the way he carried himself with a quiet confidence that seemed to mask deeper insecurities. He wasn't a boy anymore, he was a man, and it caught me off guard. My husband had been traveling for work more frequently, leaving the house feeling emptier than usual. Maybe that's why I began to gravitate toward Liam, seeking some kind of connection, even if it was purely familial. Or at least that's what I told myself. That night, after the bathroom incident, I couldn't sleep. Eric was away again, and the house felt too quiet, too still. I tossed and turned, my thoughts a jumbled mess. The memory of Liam's vulnerable expression kept replaying in my mind. Why did it affect me so much? Why couldn't I just let it go? It was probably nothing. He was just going through something, like any young adult would. But the way he looked at me, the way his voice wavered, stuck with me. The next morning, I tried to brush it off and focus on my usual routine. I made coffee, tidied up the living room, and planned my errands for the day. Liam emerged from the basement around noon, his hair still damp from a shower, wearing a plain white t-shirt and sweatpants. He looked refreshed, but still carried that same air of melancholy. "Oh, morning," I greeted him, forcing a cheerful tone. "Morning," he replied, his voice low. He grabbed a mug and poured himself some coffee, his movements deliberate and slow. "How'd you sleep?" I asked, desperate to fill the silence. He shrugged. "Okay, I guess." I hesitated, unsure if I should bring up the previous night. "Listen, about yesterday?" I didn't mean to barge in on you like that. Well, I was worried." He looked at me, his eyes softening slightly. "It's fine, Aunt Jenna, really. I probably just looked pathetic sitting there." "You didn't," I said quickly, maybe too quickly. "You just seemed upset." He sighed, leaning against the counter and staring into his coffee. "It's just been a lot lately, trying to figure out what I'm doing with my life, feeling like a failure all the time. It gets to you." Facing none but himself, he stood facing his son, his eyes widening with a sense of guilt. "Is he created one of these?" He looked down at himself, something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. "You're not a failure, Liam. You're just figuring things out. It's okay to feel lost sometimes." He gave me a faint smile, the corners of his lips barely lifting. "Thanks. That means a lot." The conversation felt heavier than it should have, and I quickly changed the subject, asking about his plans for the day. He mentioned going for a run and maybe looking into some job applications. I nodded, grateful for the shift in tone, but the weight of his words stayed with me. Over the next few days, I found myself watching him more closely. Not intentionally, at least that's what I told myself. But I couldn't help it. The way he moved, the way he spoke, even the way he smiled at me when he thought I wasn't looking. It all seemed to draw me in. And I hated it. I hated the way my heart quickened when he entered the room, the way my thoughts drifted to him when I should have been focusing on something else. One evening, after Eric called to say he'd be staying an extra week for work, Liam and I ended up watching a movie together. It was a casual thing. He was already in the living room when I walked in, and he asked if I wanted to join him. I hesitated for a moment, but then sat down, keeping a safe distance between us on the couch. The movie played, but I barely registered what was happening on the screen. My focus was on him. how he laughed at the funny parts, how his arm rested casually on the back of the couch, how his presence seemed to fill the entire room. At one point, our hands brushed as we reached for the popcorn bowl, and I pulled back quickly, my face heating up. Then the movie started and I was spellbound. "Sorry," I muttered, avoiding his gaze. He chuckled softly. "It's okay. It's just popcorn." But it wasn't just popcorn, and we both knew it. That night, as I lay in bed, the guilt washed over me in waves. What was wrong with me? This was Liam, my nephew. And yet I couldn't shake the way he made me feel, alive, seen, and utterly confused. I told myself it was just a phase, that it would pass. But deep down, I knew it was only the beginning. The days turned into weeks, and I found myself slipping further into an emotional limbo. On the surface, everything was normal. I went about my daily routine, smiling at neighbors, texting Eric updates about the house, and pretending that nothing had changed. But inside, I was unraveling. The lines I'd once thought were unbreakable, boundaries I'd never imagined crossing, began to blur in the quiet moments I shared with Liam. It wasn't anything overt. If someone had been watching, they wouldn't have seen anything unusual. But the tension between us was palpable, a current that hummed beneath the surface of every interaction. Every accidental touch, every lingering glance, every shared laugh seemed to carry more weight than it should have. One evening, as I prepared dinner, Liam came into the kitchen. His presence, as always, filled the space in a way that was both comforting and disconcerting. He leaned against the counter, watching me with a small smile. "You don't have to cook, you know," he said. "I could have made something." "It's no trouble," I replied, my voice steady but my heart pounding. "Besides, you need a real meal. I'm sure ramen and takeout aren't exactly doing you any favors." He chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Fair point. But seriously, you do too much." I shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "It keeps me busy." And then, "Is that why you do it? To stay busy?" His question hung in the air, laden with an implication I didn't want to unpack. I turned to him, forcing a light smile. "What else would I do? Maybe something for yourself?" he said, his voice softer now. "You deserve that, you know." I didn't respond, couldn't respond, because the way he was looking at me, so earnest, so sincere, made my throat tighten. The moment stretched, and I busied myself with stirring the sauce, hoping to dissolve the tension. But when he stepped closer, his proximity sending a shiver up my spine, I realized there was no escaping it. I knew. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone gentle but probing. "Is everything okay?" "Yes," I lied, my voice coming out too quickly. "Of course." He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes, the way his brows furrowed slightly. "You know, you can talk to me too. It's not just a one-way street." I forced a laugh, hoping to lighten the mood. "Since when did you become so wise?" He grinned, his expression softening. "I've always been wise. You just never noticed." The moment broke as the timer went off, and I turned back to the stove, relieved for the distraction. But the way he lingered in the kitchen, his presence a constant pull, left me unsettled. Later that night, as I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, Liam came into the living room. He hesitated for a moment before sitting beside me, closer than usual. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to remain calm, to act normal. "What are you watching?" he asked, nodding toward the TV. Nothing much, I said, gesturing to the remote. Want to pick something? He took it, his fingers brushing mine, and I felt that now familiar spark. I told myself it was nothing, just a silly reaction to the situation. But when he chose a movie and settled back, his arm casually draped over the back of the couch, I couldn't deny the charged atmosphere between us. As the movie played, I became acutely aware of every detail. The warmth radiating from his body, the way his leg brushed against mine when he shifted, the way his hand rested so close to my shoulder. It was maddening, this silent dance of almosts and maybes. Halfway through, I felt him glance at me. I tried to ignore it, but the weight of his gaze was impossible to miss. When I finally turned to meet his eyes, I saw something there that sent a shiver through me. Curiosity, longing, and something deeper, something dangerous. "You seem tense," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine," I replied, but my voice betrayed me, shaky and uncertain. "No, you're not." His words were soft but firm, and they hung between us like a challenge. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. And then, to my surprise, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was a simple gesture, innocent on the surface, but it ignited a storm of emotions I couldn't contain. "Liam," I began, my voice faltering. I know," he said quickly, his eyes searching mine. "I know it's complicated. He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what's happening, but I can't stop thinking about you." My breath caught, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest. "You shouldn't say that," I whispered, though the words lacked conviction. "I know I shouldn't," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "But it's the truth." For a moment, neither of us moved, the silence between us deafening. I wanted to say something, to push him away or pull him closer. I wasn't sure which. But the weight of the moment held me in place, paralyzed by the conflict raging within me. Finally, I stood, breaking the spell. "I think we both need some space," I said, my voice trembling. "Good night, Liam." He didn't argue, didn't try to stop me. He simply nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and longing that tore at my heart. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I felt a wave of guilt and confusion wash over me. What was I doing? What was I allowing to happen? I told myself it was just a fleeting moment, a slip in judgment that would never happen again. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The line we'd both been dancing around had been crossed, and there was no going back. The next morning, the weight of the previous night hung over me like a storm cloud. I avoided Liam entirely, staying upstairs under the guise of cleaning out closets and organizing old photo albums. Anything to avoid facing the tension simmering between us. But by mid-afternoon, I knew I couldn't keep hiding. I made my way downstairs, bracing myself for the inevitable. Liam was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a mug in his hands. He looked up when I entered, his face unreadable. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. I busied myself with making tea, avoiding his gaze. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Liam broke it. About last night." My stomach tightened. "We don't have to talk about it," I said quickly, cutting him off. "It was nothing, just a misunderstanding." It didn't feel like nothing, he said softly, and the sincerity in his voice made my heart ache. I turned to him, trying to maintain control of the situation. Liam, whatever you think happened, it can't happen. It can't happen. It's not right. You know that, don't you? He set his mug down, his eyes never leaving mine. I know it's not right. But that doesn't change how I feel. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. How had we gotten here? How had I allowed this to happen? You're young, I said finally, my voice trembling. You don't know what you're saying. I'm not a kid, Jenna, he said, his tone firm but gentle. I know exactly how I feel. Yes, I'm just... I shook my head, trying to push away the swell of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. You're confused, you're going through a rough time, and you're looking for something, someone to hold on to. That's all this is. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between us. You think this is just me looking for a crutch? Do you feel the same way? I froze, my mind racing. His question cut through every rational argument I'd tried to convince myself with. Did I feel the same way? I didn't want to answer, because the truth scared me. I can't do this, I whispered, my voice breaking. You're my nephew. His expression softened and he stepped back, giving me space. I know, and I hate that it's this way, but I can't pretend I don't care about you, Jenna. His words left me breathless. I wanted to scream, to tell him to stop, but part of me didn't want him to. You have to stop, I said, my voice barely audible. Please, Liam. He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and understanding. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't mean to make things harder for you. For a moment, I thought that was the end of it. But later that evening, as I sat in the living room trying to distract myself with a book, Liam appeared in the doorway. He hesitated before stepping inside, his hands shoved into his pockets. I've been thinking, he began, his voice hesitant. Maybe I should move out. His words caught me off guard. What? Why? It's just... Things are complicated, he said, avoiding my gaze. I don't want to make it worse for you. You don't have to leave, I said quickly, the thought of him being gone sending a pang of sadness through me. This is your home, Liam. Is it? He asked, his eyes finally meeting mine. Because it doesn't feel that way anymore. I didn't know how to respond. The thought of him leaving felt like losing a part of myself, but I couldn't deny that his presence had turned my life upside down. Maybe it's for the best, he said after a long silence, for both of us. I swallowed hard, nodding, even though it felt like my heart was breaking. If that's what you think you need to do. He nodded, his jaw tightening. I'll start looking for a place tomorrow. When he left the room, I felt a wave of relief, mixed with a deep, aching sadness. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was better this way. But as the days passed, and Liam began making plans to move out, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing something I couldn't replace. The night before he was set to leave, he knocked on my bedroom door. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. He stood there, his expression serious but calm. I just wanted to say thank you, he said, for everything. You didn't have to take me in, and I know I haven't made it easy for you. I forced a smile, my throat tight. You don't have to thank me. Your family. He nodded, but his eyes said so much more. I'll miss you, he said softly. and the vulnerability in his voice shattered the fragile wall I'd built around my emotions. "I'll miss you too," I admitted, my voice breaking. "But maybe this is the right thing to do." "Maybe," he agreed, though neither of us sounded convinced. As he turned to leave, I called out to him, "Liam?" He stopped, looking back at me. "Yeah?" "Take care of yourself, okay?" He smiled, a bittersweet expression that made my heart ache. "You too, Jenna." When the door closed behind him, I felt the weight of finality settle over me. It was the right thing to do. It had to be. But as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder if it was also the greatest mistake of my life. The morning came all too quickly, and with it, the reality that Liam was leaving. I woke up to the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the faint creak of the front door as he carried his belongings out to his car. The house felt colder, emptier, even though he hadn't left yet. I lingered in my room, hesitant to face him, unsure of what I'd say or how I'd feel watching him drive away. By the time I made my way downstairs, Liam was in the living room, standing amidst the few boxes he had left to carry out. He turned when he heard me enter, offering a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning, morning," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. I glanced around, searching for something to hold on to, an excuse to delay his departure. But the house was unnervingly tidy, as if it were already preparing itself for his absence. "Everything's packed," he said, gesturing toward the boxes. "I'll be out of here in a couple of hours." I nodded, my throat too tight to form words. The finality of his statement hit me like a wave, and I fought the urge to ask him to stay, to find some way to make things work. Instead, I busied myself in the kitchen making coffee and preparing breakfast as if it were any other day. But my hands trembled as I worked, and I could feel Liam's eyes on me from the living room. When I brought the coffee to him, he took the mug with a quiet "thanks," his fingers brushing against mine. Even that small touch sent a shiver through me, a painful reminder of everything we were leaving unspoken. "You don't have to go," I blurted out, surprising even myself. He looked up at me, his expression a mix of surprise and something else. "Hope, maybe?" "Jenna," I whispered into his ear. "I mean it," I continued, my words tumbling out in a rush. "This is your home. You shouldn't have to leave because of me." "It's not just you," he said gently. "It's everything, the way things have been. I don't think staying here is good for either of us." I nodded, unable to argue, even though his words stung. I don't want you to feel like you have to go." He stepped closer, setting the mug down on the coffee table. "I don't want to go," he admitted, his voice low. "But I think I need to." There was a vulnerability in his eyes that made my chest ache, but I knew he was right. Staying here would only complicate things further. And as much as I hated the thought of losing him, I couldn't let my feelings keep him from moving forward with his life. "Okay," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "If that's what you think is best." He nodded, a small bittersweet smile playing at his lips. "It is." The rest of the morning passed in a blur. I helped him carry the last of his boxes to the car, the weight of each one feeling heavier than it should have. When everything was loaded, we stood by the driveway, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. "Well," he said, breaking the silence, "I guess this is it." "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "This is it." He hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but instead he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. The hug was warm and lingering, and I found myself holding on to him tighter than I intended. "Take care of yourself," he said as he pulled away, his voice thick with emotion. "You too," I replied, my throat tight. He climbed into his car, and I stood on the driveway, watching as he pulled away. The sound of his engine faded into the distance, leaving the house unnervingly silent. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty street, the weight of his absence settling over me. For the next few weeks, the house felt like a ghost of itself. Every room seemed to echo with his presence, every quiet moment reminding me of what I'd lost. Eric came home from his business trip a few days after Liam left, but even his presence did little to fill the void. I went through the motions, smiling when I needed to, but inside I felt hollow. One evening, as I was tidying up the living room, I found a folded piece of paper tucked between the couch cushions. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized Liam's handwriting on the front. "Jenna." I sat down, my hands trembling, as I unfolded the note. "Jenna, I just wanted to say thank you for everything, for giving me a place to stay, for listening, for being there when I needed someone. You have no idea how much that meant to me. I know things got complicated between us, and I'm sorry if I made things harder for you. That was never my intention, but I want you to know that I'll never forget how much you did for me and how much you mean to me. You're an amazing person, and I hope someday you see that the way I do. Take care of yourself, and if you ever need anything, I'm just a phone call away. And reach out, Liam." I pressed the note to my chest, tears streaming down my face. The words were simple, but they carried so much weight, so much emotion. I felt a mix of sadness and relief, knowing that despite everything, we'd both managed to walk away without completely falling apart. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild. I threw myself into work, reconnected with old friends, and started focusing on my marriage with Eric. It wasn't easy, and the memory of Liam lingered like a ghost in the back of my mind, but I knew it was for the best. We'd both made the choice to protect what we had, even if it meant letting go of something we couldn't fully understand. Life moved on, and so did I. But every now and then, I'd think about that note, about the way Liam looked at me the last time we spoke. And though it hurt, it also reminded me of the strength it took to walk away. In the quiet moments of the days and weeks that followed Liam's departure, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The house felt different now, quieter, emptier. It wasn't just his absence that left a void. It was the weight of everything unsaid, the unresolved feelings lingering like ghosts in the corners of every room. Eric returned home a few days after Liam left, his usual upbeat demeanor a comforting distraction. He talked about his trip, the deals he closed, and the people he met. I listened, nodding in all the right places, but my mind kept drifting back to Liam. I hated how much space he still occupied in my thoughts, how much his absence felt like a wound that refused to heal. One evening, as Eric and I sat on the couch watching TV, he reached over and took my hand. It was a small gesture, one he'd done countless times before, but tonight it felt different. I realized how distant I'd become, how much I'd let the cracks in our relationship grow wider without even noticing. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Of course, just tired, that's all." But he didn't look convinced. "You've seemed off lately, like something's been bothering you." I hesitated, the truth sitting heavy on my chest. How could I explain everything I'd been feeling? The guilt, the confusion, the ache of letting go of something I'd never even had. "I guess I've just been stressed," I said finally, avoiding his gaze. "Work, the house. It's been a lot." He squeezed my hand, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "I'm here if you need to talk, you know." The kindness in his voice only made the guilt worse. He had no idea what had been happening while he was away, no clue about the turmoil that had been brewing inside me. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the full weight of my choices, not just the ones I'd made, but the ones I hadn't. I'd let myself drift away from my marriage, seeking something I couldn't even name. And now, it was time to face the consequences. The next day, I decided to make an effort. I planned an ice dinner, lit candles, and opened a bottle of wine. When Eric came home, his face lit up in surprise. "What's all this?" he asked, setting down his briefcase. "Just thought we could have a nice evening," I said, smiling. "No work, no distractions." He grinned, leaning down to kiss me. I liked the sound of that. We sat at the table talking and laughing like we hadn't in months. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a flicker of hope, like maybe we could find our way back to each other. But even as I smiled and laughed, a small part of me couldn't help but think of Liam. Would I ever stop thinking about him? Would the memory of him ever stop haunting me? Later that night, as I lay in bed beside Eric, my thoughts drifted to the note Liam had left behind. I'd read it so many times I practically had it memorized. His words were both a comfort and a curse, reminding me of what we'd shared and what we'd lost. I missed him, but I also knew that letting him go had been the right thing to do for both of us. As the weeks turned into months, I began to rebuild. I threw myself into projects around the house, redecorating the guest room that had once been Liam's. It was therapeutic in a way. Painting the walls, choosing new curtains, turning the space into something entirely different. It felt like a fresh start, a way to close the door on that chapter of my life. But no matter how much I tried to move on, there were moments when the memories would creep in. A certain song on the radio, a whiff of cologne in the grocery store, the way the sunlight filtered through the kitchen window in the morning. It all brought him back, and each time I felt the same mix of sadness and longing, the same ache that never seemed to fully fade. One afternoon, as I sorted through old photos in the attic, I came across a picture of Liam and me from a family barbecue. He was grinning at the camera, his arm slung casually around my shoulders. I stared at the photo for a long time, my fingers tracing the edges of the frame. He looked so young, so carefree, and I couldn't help but smile. For all the pain and confusion that had come with his presence, there had also been joy. He'd reminded me of things I'd forgotten about myself. How to laugh, how to feel, how to live. That night I sat down and wrote him a letter. I didn't plan to send it. It was more for me than for him. But putting my thoughts into words felt like a release, a way to finally let go. Dear Liam, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking about you a lot lately, and I wanted to say thank you for everything, for your kindness, your patience, and for the way you always made me feel seen. I miss you more than I can put into words, but I also know that letting you go was the right thing to do. You deserve to build a life for yourself, to find happiness and success and everything you've ever wanted. And I hope you know that I'll always be rooting for you no matter where life takes us. Take care of yourself, Liam. You'll always have a piece of my heart. I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer, a small weight lifting from my chest. It wasn't closure. Not entirely. But it was a step forward. And as I climbed into bed that night, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Life went on. The memories remained, but they no longer felt like chains holding me back. Instead, they became a part of me, a reminder of the complexities of life and love and everything in between. And though I didn't know what the future held, I knew one thing for certain. I was stronger than I'd ever realized. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. The house no longer felt quite as empty, and the ache of Liam's absence softened into something more manageable. I focused on my marriage, reconnecting with Eric in ways we hadn't done in years. We took a weekend trip to the mountains, started cooking together in the evenings, and even laughed like we used to. Slowly, the cracks in our relationship began to heal, but Liam's memory never fully left me. It lingered in quiet moments, in the spaces where life slowed and my thoughts wandered. I often wondered how he was doing, whether he'd found a place to call his own, whether he was happy, whether he ever thought of me. One afternoon, as I was cleaning the kitchen, the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat, an irrational hope surging through me. But when I opened the door, it wasn't Liam. It was a package. The box was plain with no sender listed, but my name was written on the front in familiar handwriting. I brought it inside, my hands trembling as I opened it. Inside was a single photograph and a short note. The photo was of a small, cozy apartment with sunlight streaming through the windows. A guitar rested against the wall, and a stack of books sat on the coffee table. It was unmistakably Liam's space. The note was simple, written in his familiar scrawl. Jenna, I thought you might like to see where I ended up. It's not much, but it's mine, and it feels like home. I've been doing okay. Better, actually. And a big part of that is because of you. Thank you for everything. I mean that. I hope you're doing well. You deserve to be happy. Always, Liam. I sat down, the note clutched in my hands, tears streaming down my face. It was a bittersweet moment. Proof that he was moving on, building a life for himself, just as he'd said he would. But it was also a reminder of the connection we'd shared, one that could never truly be erased. I tucked the note and photo into the drawer, alongside the letter I'd written to him months earlier. They felt like bookends to a chapter of my life, one that had been messy and painful and beautiful all at once. That evening, as Eric and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was mine, and I was learning to embrace every flawed, complicated moment of it. And as the sky turned shades of pink and orange, I allowed myself one final thought of Liam, a silent wish that he too had found the peace we both deserved. The chapter was closed, but the lessons it taught me would stay forever.